Good morning, gang. Bob DeVance for the Dressler Bible Fellowship Group for Sunday, September the 27th. My goodness, the month has gotten away quickly, hasn't it? But it's, I guess that's the way the time is supposed to work, isn't it? We'll bring greetings from McPherson, Kansas. We're about 30 miles or so south of Salina. A very nice little park here. The great part about it is we're right next to, maybe within 100 yards or less, of a cell phone tower. So we have tremendous internet connectivity here, so this should make it easy to upload this video whenever we get through with it. Anyway, that's what we're counting on. Last Sunday's lesson was rather interesting. We were at our daughter and son-in-law's up in Montana, and they live way out in the boonies, and they have a wired internet connection to their house. However, their upload speed is relatively slow compared to what we're accustomed to seeing around Dallas anyway. And it took about 2 hours to upload the video through their internet connection, but it was solid and we got it there, and hopefully all was well. A little bit late, but we did get it done. So hopefully we will be a little earlier today and we'll get this out to you. So anyway, let's jump right into it and see what this lesson does for us. We're talking from Isaiah 23. The title of the lesson is God Reigns, and the idea behind it is that God reigns supreme over the affairs of nations. I think this is a really good lesson for us today in view of what's going on around us right now, and even within our own nation, with all the difficulties in the nation, the differences and the upheavals that are going on right now. And of course, around the world, there have been, and seem like there always will be, I suppose, until Jesus comes anyway. There have been upheavals in the world between nations as well. And we go back into this lesson, it reminds us that God is still in control. God is sovereign over the affairs of men, over the affairs of nations. So I think this will be, again, as I said, a good lesson, very appropriate for our time. I hope you have the handout handy and follow along with that. This is an interesting section of Isaiah, actually chapters 13 through 23. We land in 23 today, as we said. But those chapters describe the chastisement and the fall of many of the nations that were or had been on the scene in Isaiah's time, starting with Babylon and then ending with Tyre in those 13 to 23, those chapters. God gave Isaiah his message of judgment on each one of the different grand nations at the time, and how they either had fallen or how they would fall in time. The point there, again, is that God establishes the nations, and he deposes the nations as he decides. And of course, we know that God uses one nation to punish another nation oftentimes, even as he used Babylon to punish Judah some 100 or so years after the time of Isaiah. So we see this described. The psalmist has an interesting commentary, I think, on this in Psalm chapter 2, the first 4 verses, which says, "Why do the nations rage, and the people plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us break their bonds in pieces and cast their cords away from us. He who sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall hold them in derision." And the psalmist is just saying essentially that men, the leaders of nations, leaders within nations, cut all of these different plans and have all their different ideologies on how things are going to be, not giving God credit for the fact that he is the one who ultimately governs the rise and the fall of nations and leaders. And I think God chuckles at some of the machinations that our leaders go through in the nations, even today, in our time. Well, as we witness all the intrigue of the nations and the intrigue within nations today, again, we remember that God is in control of the nations and even the factions within those nations. Now, as we said, 13 through 23 of Isaiah list a number of different nations. I just want to do a quick recap on what's in those chapters. It's a real good history lesson at the same time, because the prophecies that Isaiah gave obviously came to pass. First was Babylon, started in chapter 13. These different nations represent an ideology generally, which God is punishing. Babylon false religions, and idolatry. Now, the Babylon there we were talking about was during the time of the Chaldeans, not the Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar and subsequent. But anyway, it represented false religions and idolatry, going in all directions on everything except going to God himself. Number 2, Palestine, which basically is the land of God's people, Israel and Judah. True religion, which becomes apostate. Obviously, they did have the true religion. They worshiped God, they followed God, and then they became apostate. They fell away. Moab, formal religion. In 2 Timothy 3:5, Paul warns Timothy about those who have a form of godliness but deny its power in the last times. And I think that's what we're talking about here. Moab had form and formality, but it had no substance in its religion. Damascus, known for compromise. You give a little, I'll give a little, and in the end it doesn't matter who gives what, as long as we can all make it work out, kind of an idea. Ethiopia, missions, the need for getting the word out to the people. Missions. Egypt, representing the world system, the system as directed by Satan himself and in control of Satan himself. The world system without God. Persia, or Babylon again, excess luxury. So much luxury that that's all they thought about. They were consumed with that. Edom, the flesh, living life in the flesh. Another word for that might be selfishness. Very selfish, living for today and for me. Number 9, Arabia, guilty of war, love to go to war, create problems along the way, and try to be king of the hill, if you want to call it that. The Valley of Vision, which is an interesting term, actually refers to Jerusalem, the city itself. Corrupt politics, how the politics, not the religious world per se, but the politics of it all were playing out between the rulers and the religious leaders and others. A really corrupt political situation that came along. And last, Tyre, which we're talking about today. Tyre is condemned for its commercialism. Now, God is not against capitalism, nor against commercialism, nor against making a profit. That's not the point. The point is that the commercialism of Tyre was laced with pride and with greed. They were pretty much the king of the hill again in the commercial world of their day. They had fleets of ships, as you might recall. They were masters of the sea of their time, and they plied their trade throughout the then known world, largely all around the Mediterranean Ocean, even going up as far as southern Spain. And we'll see some more about that come up here shortly. But they were traders. They were importers. They were exporters. They carried goods back and forth, and they made a lot of money out of it. And because of that, they were proud of what they were. They were also proud of their location. We'll talk more about that in a minute as well. Their location and their natural protection for their city. They felt that they were impregnable. Nothing could happen to them. And of course, unfortunately, with commercialism comes the greed. I've got a little, I want some more, and then I want some more, and I want some more after that. The story is told that someone asked one of the Rockefellers, how much money is enough? And he said, well, we're working on it. We don't know. He said, well, how much more do you want? And he said, well, just one more dollar. Just one more dollar. And that's the epitome of greed, just always wanting one more dollar or whatever quantity of money it happens to be. Okay, so we have all these different oracles or writings, or in the King James, burdens, against the nations, really, of Isaiah's time, but both before and after. But how does that apply to us today? What does the city-nation of Tyre have to do with us today? Well, let's jump into the scriptures and talk about it, and we'll see if we can answer that question as we go along. Isaiah 23, verse 8 is our launch point today. In the first 7 verses, Isaiah has talked about Tyre and some of its geographical layout and some of the things going on there in Tyre. Now we pick it up here. Who has taken counsel against Tyre, the crowning city, whose merchants are princes and whose traders are the honorable of the earth? Who has taken counsel against the city of Tyre and all of its greatness? Well, we're going to answer that question specifically in verse 9 in the next verse. We'll see that come out. But why is Tyre described like this? As we said, Tyre was a financial powerhouse based on the vast and extremely successful seafaring trade which she had created. She had also done a lot of colonization. You might recall that the British Empire did this at one time. They would create colonies, not just Great Britain, but other nations as well. But anyway, they would create colonies here and there, and those colonies would pay tribute and support the mother country. And so that was true with Tyre as well. Tarshish is one of those that was a colony that apparently belonged to Tyre. We think was off the southern coast of Spain once again. The city itself was located on an island citadel a little ways out, a quarter of a mile or so out from the mainland. And because of that sea around them, they felt that nothing could touch them. Nobody could get to them because of that. The main city of Tyre had at one time been on the mainland and was essentially destroyed. And the people moved out to the island and created their fortress, if you will, there and set up their city there so that they felt like they were very, very secure. Of course, we know from history that was not to be the case. Actually, the city of Tyre was taken under control by Assyria and shut down for a period of time. Basically, her activities were greatly restricted. And later, Alexander the Great in 322 BC conquered the city of Tyre. It's interesting that history tells us that Alexander actually scraped up all of the remains, the debris from the former city of Tyre on the mainland and built a causeway out to the island city with that so that his soldiers could actually get out to Tyre on the little island, which I think is rather interesting and again intriguing. In a modern context, we might liken Tyre's fall, which is to come, to the absolute complete fall of New York City and the devastation that would come along with that. You remember on 9/11, the devastation that ensued because of that one attack on two buildings. If you could imagine enlarging that to all of the buildings in New York City and bringing all of them down, what kind of devastation would that bring to the financial world? It would bring a lot for finances, for communications, for transportation, almost any area of life that we can think of. And this is the essence of what happened to Tyre when they were destroyed. Because so many other nations depended on Tyre, those other nations were affected. Likewise, if New York City fell, there are many nations around the world whose commerce goes through New York City. And it would impact those nations equally as well. So that was the situation that was coming up for Tyre. Going on, Isaiah 23, 9 and 10. Who's proposed to do this? The Lord of hosts has proposed it. God himself. And he is to bring dishonor to the pride of all glory, to bring into contempt the honorable of the earth, overflow through your land like a river, O daughter of Tarshish, for there's no more strength. God has proposed to bring to dishonor those who, in their pride, essentially spit in his eye. You know, it's also interesting to note that the attitude of that time toward the gods was gods plural with a little g, was interesting. Each nation felt it had its own god, and Tyre felt like it had its own god, plus it had its gods of the sea, which it felt protected its sailors as they went out on their missions. And we know, of course, those were false gods anyway, but that was their ideology. If two nations got in conflict, the two nations' gods would be at each other and fight for those nations. And unfortunately, it would seem like some of that ideology had crept into Judah, perhaps with King Ahaz in particular, that the God of Israel was just one God among many other gods, and if he were big enough to protect them, he could do so, and if he weren't big enough to protect them, then the other gods would overcome him. And of course, we know that's far from the truth. There is only one God, capital G, and he controls the affairs of men and nations, as we said, all the way around. Tarshish, we mentioned that. We think that's the same city that Jonah was headed for. You'll recall that Jonah booked passage on a ship to Tarshish, which was essentially the farthest known point at the time, basically, as he was trying to escape from God. The Phoenician city, the Phoenician colony there, as we said, we think was Tarshish, was located in Spain. But when Tyre would fall, Tarshish would be freed, basically. They would be free to spread out, much like the Nile River when it overflowed. They could do whatever they pleased when they wanted. There would be no real restraints over them. They could do as they wanted. God would bring down the mighty Tyre and free that colony city. Going on, Isaiah 23, 11 and 12. He stretched out his hand over the sea. Now we're talking personal here for the Phoenicians. He stretched out his hand over the sea. He shook the kingdoms. The Lord has given a commandment against Canaan to destroy its strongholds. And he said, you will rejoice no more, O you oppressed daughter of Sidon. Arise, cross over to Cyprus. There also you'll have no rest. So God is saying that the Canaanites, who were closely allied and related to the Phoenicians, all of those that are in there are going to fall. God has given a commandment against them, against their strongholds. And then this about the virgin daughter of Sidon. Sidon was the other city in Phoenicia that was a big deal. Sidon had apparently started the city of Tyre way back when, hence she's called the daughter of Sidon. And then ultimately, the prophet says, you can cross over to the nation of Cyprus, but you won't find rest there either. We know Jonah found out the hard way that was the case, didn't he? When he was pursuing a way to get away from God's judgment, he found that there was no escape. There was no escaping God's judgment. Going on, 23, 13, and 14. Behold, the land of the Chaldeans, the people which are not. And again, we're talking about early Babylon, prior to the time of Nebuchadnezzar and way back before that. The land of the Chaldeans, the people which was not. Assyria founded it basically destroyed it to be for wild beasts of the desert. They set up its towers, they raised up its palaces and brought it to ruin. So just like that group of people had fallen, the Chaldeans had fallen, so would Tyre. Wail, you ships of Tarshish, for your strength is laid waste. The ships that would come from Tarshish back to Tyre bringing their goods would come and find they have no home port, basically. They have no place to go, no place to sell their wares. Their center of commerce will have been destroyed, and they have no place to go. God would judge Tyre just as he had judged the Chaldeans that lived in Babylon prior to Nebuchadnezzar's time. 23, 15, and 16. Now it shall come to pass in that day that Tyre will be forgotten 70 years, according to the days of one king. At the end of 70 years, it will happen to Tyre as in the song of the harlot. And this gets to be a little interesting. Verse 16, take a harp. Go about the city, you forgotten harlot. Make sweet melody. Sing many songs that you may be remembered. So here we have a 70-year prophecy against Tyre, that the city would be there, but they would be down for 70 years. Historically, an interesting note is the Assyrians, as they said, took over the affairs of Tyre for a while, and from 700 to 630 BC, they essentially controlled the activities of Tyre, and they severely curtailed their trade and all the things that they were doing. So that's an interesting comment. The 70 years is also interesting. Rarely would a king reign for 70 years, much less even live for 70 years during that period of time. But that was considered to be one generation or one lifetime or one lifespan that one would have there. So there are a lot of things happen with that. Now, verses 17 and 18 tie back into that. By the way, about the song of the harlot, saying that Tyre is like a harlot going out trying to reestablish her position in the world after that 70 years. She'd sing the sweet songs and try to regain her previous popularity, which would be very, very difficult to accomplish. 17 and 18 then says, and it shall be at the end of the 70 years that the Lord will visit Tyre. She will return to her hire, commit fornication with all the kingdoms of the world on the face of the earth. But then 18 has a real twist to it. Her gain and her pay will be set apart for the Lord. It will not be treasured nor laid up, for her gain will be for those who dwell before the Lord, to eat sufficiently and for fine clothing. Okay, it's an interesting twist, as we said. As we've talked about last week, sometimes the Hebrew language, of course, leaves out some of the words that we would like to see there, such as the verbs as we use them. And so this passage is not absolutely ironclad in how you would read it. But there are several different commentators who feel very strongly that verse 18 pertains to the millennial kingdom, the 1,000-year reign of Christ on this earth, following the great tribulation and Satan's being bound for 1,000 years. That at that time, Tyre would be raised up again, but her finances, her great gain, would be given to the people of God to accommodate the people of God, both in food and in clothing. And that's certainly a possibility because, after all, God is God, isn't he? He can do whatever he chooses, and that's certainly one of the possibilities. The 70 years, then, may be kind of like the virgin shall conceive from 7:14. It can have an immediate fulfillment and a distant fulfillment, and this may as well have had the immediate fulfillment of Assyria over Tyre and a distant fulfillment in the time of the millennial kingdom. So it could very well be that. I'm certainly not going to be dogmatic about that, but it is interesting. The main point behind the whole thing, though, is still God is in control of the destiny of the nations, and Tyre is included in that. So it could easily be God will resurrect the city and use those people in the end times. Now, that's kind of going through the scripture passages rather quickly. So let's talk a little bit more about that. What's this all about anyway? And why are we bothering to study this today, 2,000 plus years after this was written? Why are we looking at it today? Well, let's take a look. Number one, God has always and will always control the nations and their destinies. He always has controlled it. He will continue to control it. As the psalmist said, he looks at the plans of men. As we tend to rebel against God in particular, he sits in the heavens and laughs about it, thinking how powerless we really are, knowing that he's totally in control. No nation is exempt from God's control. No nation. I think perhaps some Christians in this country have felt like America has been exempt, that we can do whatever we want to, we can ignore God, we can throw him out of the public arena and exempt ourselves from God's control, but not so. No nation is exempt from God's control. Ancient history bears out what the prophets, including Isaiah, have said. All in those chapters 13 to 23, as we talked about all those different nations, history bears those things out. And of course, that's true for the other prophets as they prophesied. History bears out that what they said would come to pass came to pass. Now, yes, granted, there are future prophecies to be fulfilled, sure. But based on God's history of fulfilling what he said he's going to do, is there any doubt that he will carry it through? No, not at all. God is in control. He will make it happen. He will see to it that it comes out as he has it planned out and as he wants it to end. The nations today are all under God's control and God's authority, whether they recognize it or not. A nation's recognizing and accepting God's control and authority does not govern whether or not God is in control of that nation and has authority over it. The nations can try to ignore him and do ignore him, yet God is still in control. Their attitudes, our attitudes, do not determine God's power or limit his ability to control the nations. America, let's talk about home here. America is under God's control and authority. Our culture's denial of this does not invalidate his will to be done. You know, modern culture, it seems, wants to kick out God from the public arena in this country, have no reference to God in any shape, form, or fashion. Does that invalidate God's control and authority? Absolutely not. God is in control, whether we recognize him for that purpose or not. How much are we like Tyre today? You know, we're in a fairly secure position as the world goes, though maybe not as secure in some times past with this day of all kinds of flight and space and nuclear weapons and delivery systems. But we're still relatively secure and isolated from some parts of the world just by our geography. Our military might is very good. Our financial strength is very good. So how are we like Tyre? We're much like Tyre in many of those ways. We depend on our financial and our military strength, just like they did. Sometimes we're overly proud, perhaps, of that very fact, as was Tyre. How does our pride and our greed stand in comparison to theirs? I think they're very close. They're a very close parallel in that regard. Ours is a restless nation internally today. God controls the affairs of men and societies, or culture. We might use that word. Does he sit in the heavens and laugh at the outlandish machinations of those who proclaim God is dead and then set out to prove it? I wonder if he does. And I don't laugh about it. I'm very burdened by that right now. The fact that we have cast off God. We want to be our own gods in this nation. We want to do anything we want at any time we want, with no regard for anyone else. And that's so far-reaching. From the unborn to those of us who've been born a long, long time, when we talk about euthanasia and all of the abuse that's in between. It's a dire picture, but yet God is still in control. May God open our eyes to his truth and his ways. May we be humble before him and take comfort in the fact that he is still sovereign and he will continue to be. Again, I'd like to read 2 Chronicles 7, 13 and 14, because I think they're so applicable to us today. Even though they were written to Solomon and the people of Solomon's time at the dedication of the temple, the principle is still applicable today. Those verses say, God speaking, when I shut up heaven and there's no rain, or command the locusts to devour the land, or send pestilence among my people. And with those three things, he's covered a lot of the calamities that come before us. Shutting up the heaven, no rain, I think that would include for us floods and tsunamis and forest fires and tornadoes and all the other things that come from the heavens. Command the locusts to devour the land. Any of the maladies that come within the nation itself. Pestilence among my people, which oftentimes comes from war. Everything's related to war. When those things happen, God says, if my people, not the people of the nation at large, but if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves, and that's a big one, isn't it? Will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways. That's repentance. Then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. And I believe that's still true for us today. I urge you to pray for our country. Pray for our leaders. Pray for us to have a turning back to God, a turning back to righteousness and the things for which this country was originally known. God bless you. Have a wonderful Sunday. Don't forget worship today. And we will see you along the way. Next week, we should be back on our Zoom sessions and everything back to normal. Or we may be actually meeting in person next week. I have a meeting with Larry, and we'll talk about that early this week, or this next week, and formulate our plan for the following Sunday. Hope to see you soon, either via Zoom or in person. God bless you. Have a great week.